The last move. The sky was still dark when they left the grain depot, the horizon only beginning to glow faintly with the first whispers of dawn. The SUV moved quietly along the back roads, Carter at the wheel, his eyes scanning every approaching turn as if each might conceal the headlights of a pursuing car. Marcus sat in the back beside Sarah, his frame angled slightly toward her so he could see both her and the windows. Elena occupied the passenger seat, her phone on silent but in her hand, ready. No one spoke much. Words, Marcus thought, felt heavier when you knew they might be the last you had time for before something changed. They reached the city just as the streetlights were beginning to fade, their orange halos giving way to the pale wash of morning. The bank loomed ahead, a clean, modern building with mirrored glass that reflected the awakening streets. It looked unassuming to the casual passerby, but Marcus could see the subtle signs of its true nature. The layered security cameras, the reinforced doors, the guards who were too well trained to be just guards. This was not a place you stumbled into without being noticed. Inside, the air was cool and quiet, the scent of polished stone and faint antiseptic lingering beneath the surface. Elena spoke briefly to the manager, a tall man with a clipped accent who looked like he recognized her, and within minutes they were escorted to a private room deep in the building. The walls were thick, the lighting deliberate, and the door sealed with a sound that told Marcus it wasn't meant to be opened quickly. Sarah stood before the small table where the safety deposit box was placed, her hand trembling slightly as the manager set it down. The key, her father's key, glinted faintly in the soft light. For a long moment she just stared at it, her breathing uneven. Marcus watched her closely. He knew this wasn't just a matter of unlocking metal and hinges. This was opening the last door her father had left for her, stepping into whatever he'd believed she needed to carry. Finally, she slid the key into the lock and turned it. The mechanism clicked and the lid lifted with a muted groan. Inside, there were no stacks of money, no obvious blueprints or devices. Instead, there was a single, slim, leather-bound notebook and a small black flash drive. Sarah reached for the notebook first, opening it slowly. The pages were filled with her father's handwriting, neat, precise, and dense with sketches, formulas, and annotations. Elena leaned closer, her eyes scanning the pages. "It's here," she murmured. "The entire energy storage design. He didn't just work on it, he perfected it." Sarah's voice was quiet, almost dazed. "He told me it could give power to entire cities without burning fuel. No dependence on grids, no blackouts. He said it could change the world." Marcus frowned. "And the people after you, they don't want to change the world. They want to own it." Before anyone could answer, Carter's voice cut through the moment, low and urgent. "We've got movement. 3 men just came through the main entrance. They're not here to open accounts." The air in the room tightened instantly. Elena moved with calm precision, sliding the notebook and flash drive back into the box before tucking it into Sarah's bag. "We leave now. Back exit." They moved quickly, but not recklessly, following Carter down a narrow corridor that led to a service door. Marcus kept himself between Sarah and the sound of approaching footsteps that echoed faintly behind them. The door opened to an alleyway where the morning air felt sharper, cooler. The SUV was parked just around the corner, and for a heartbeat it looked like they might make it clean. Then the first man appeared at the mouth of the alley. Marcus, Elena, and Sarah would take a secondary route into the city before first light, aiming to reach the bank before it even opened to the public. By the time the plan was set, night had fully fallen and the depot was bathed in shadows. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the old siding. The sound made Marcus think of the farmhouse, of the glint of a rifle scope in the trees, and he knew in his bones that the next move would decide everything. Sarah sat beside him on an old bench, her voice low. "Why are you helping me? You could have walked away this morning." Marcus looked at her, and in the dim light, his expression was unreadable. "Because yesterday I stopped to help a stranger. Today you're not a stranger anymore. And tomorrow we'll see if we can make it so neither of us has to keep looking over our shoulders." She didn't answer, but the way she looked at him then carried more weight than words could hold. When they finally lay down to rest in the depot's upper loft, Marcus stayed awake longer than the others, listening to the wind and the distant hum of the occasional passing car. He knew the next day wasn't just about unlocking a box in some bank. It was about opening the door to whatever truth had been chasing Sarah all this time, and deciding whether he was ready for what came out. Shifting the hunt. The SUV didn't slow until they were more than 10 miles from the farmhouse, winding through a network of back roads that only locals or people with a good map would know. The sun was dipping lower now, casting a warm amber glow across the fields, but to Marcus, the light didn't feel safe. It felt like the final warning before night swallowed the land whole. Carter finally eased the vehicle onto a dirt path that led to an abandoned grain depot, a squat, weather-stained structure that looked like it hadn't seen work in decades. They parked behind the depot, hidden from the road. Inside, the air smelled faintly of rust and old wood. Shafts of fading sunlight streamed through gaps in the siding, painting thin golden lines across the dusty floor. Carter did another sweep of the perimeter while Elena walked to the far side of the room, her heels clicking softly on the boards. Sarah stayed close to Marcus, not because she'd been told to, but because some instinct told her that staying near him meant staying alive. Marcus scanned the interior, noting the single entrance and the row of broken windows along the back wall. "This isn't going to hold if they find us," he said quietly. "It's not meant to," Elena replied without turning around. "We're not staying here long. I just needed a place to think without a rifle scope aimed at us." Marcus studied her profile, the precise way she stood, still but ready, like a chess player who already had 3 moves planned. "Thinking's good," he said, "but planning's better. You've been leading this so far, but it's time I get a say. Those men aren't just going to disappear because we keep running." Elena finally faced him. "And what do you propose?" Marcus stepped forward, his voice steady but carrying a weight that filled the space. "We stop being the ones chased. We turn it around. We make them come to us on her terms." Sarah frowned. "That sounds like inviting trouble." "It's not an invitation," Marcus said. "It's bait. If they think they've found us, they'll come fast and sloppy. That's when they make mistakes. And mistakes are how we end this before someone gets killed." Carter had returned by then, silent but listening. He gave a slight nod as if to say he understood the shift in tone. "You're talking about setting a trap," he said. "Exactly," Marcus replied. "But to do that, I need to know exactly what they're after. No half-truths, no vague answers. Sarah, if there's something you haven't told me, now's the time." The silence that followed was different this time, heavier, like the air before a summer storm. Sarah's hands tightened around the strap of her bag, her gaze flicking between Marcus and Elena. Finally, she exhaled. "My father didn't just work for that company," she said. "He led a project, something about advanced energy storage. He told me once it could change everything, make entire cities independent from the grid. Before he died, he left me a safety deposit key. I've never opened it. I was afraid of what I'd find, or who would be watching if I did, but they think I have whatever's inside." Marcus processed this quietly, the pieces sliding into place. "So this isn't about you personally. It's about something they believe you can access." Sarah nodded, her eyes fixed on the dusty floor. "And as long as I'm out here, they'll keep coming." Marcus turned to Elena. "Where's the deposit box?" Elena hesitated for the first time since he'd met her. "A private bank in the city, high security. But going there now is dangerous. It's the first place they'll watch." Marcus shook his head. "Not if they think we're somewhere else." For the next hour, they worked out the details. Carter would plant false leads, a borrowed vehicle parked at a motel, credit CT, hard charges at a diner across the county, to make it look like they were heading in the opposite direction. Meanwhile, but the corner of his mouth twitched in the smallest ghost of approval. As the forest thinned and the first signs of Brooksville appeared on the horizon, Marcus finally leaned back, exhaling slowly. He didn't say it out loud, but he knew there was no going back to the quiet life now, not when the road behind them was still holding shadows. Nowhere is safe. They didn't go straight back to Brooksville. Elena insisted on making one more stop before they returned to familiar ground. A safe house on the outskirts of town, disguised as nothing more than a weather-worn farmhouse sitting behind a split-rail fence. From the outside, it looked like the kind of place that had been forgotten by time, its paint faded, its shutters hanging slightly askew. But the moment Marcus stepped inside, he realized the appearance was deliberate. The interior was clean, sparse, and methodically arranged. The furniture was minimal, but the locks on the doors were new and the windows were fitted with reinforced glass. Even the faint hum in the walls told him there was more wiring in here than any old farmhouse had a right to contain. Sarah moved through the space like she was half there, her body in the room but her mind somewhere else entirely. She paused by the kitchen table, her fingers brushing against a ceramic mug, then pulled back as if she'd thought better of it. Carter did a sweep of the perimeter, checking each door and window with quiet efficiency before nodding once to Elena. Only then did she speak. "This will do for now," she said, setting her coat neatly over the back of a chair. "Marcus, you should know. The men in that sedan weren't freelancers. They're part of a network, organized, disciplined, the kind of people who don't waste resources unless they believe the prize is worth it." Marcus leaned against the counter, his arms folded loosely. "And you think the prize is say?" Elena's eyes shifted towards Sarah. "Not her. What she's carrying." Sarah's voice came out sharper than she intended. "I'm not carrying anything. I've told you that." "You may believe that," Elena replied calmly, "but they don't. And until they do, you're a target." The room went still again, the kind of stillness that wasn't peace but the quiet before something broke. Marcus studied Sarah, searching for any sign that she was holding something back. She met his gaze for a moment before looking away, and that was all it took for him to know. There was more to this story. Maybe she wasn't lying about not having whatever they wanted, but she wasn't telling the whole truth either. By late afternoon, the farmhouse had settled into an uneasy rhythm. Carter sat near the front window, his eyes moving between the road and a small handheld radio. Elena made a series of quiet phone calls in another room. Sarah busied herself in the kitchen, though Marcus could tell it was less about cooking and more about giving her hands something to do. Marcus stepped outside for air, the wooden porch creaking softly under his weight. From here, the fields stretched wide, their edges blurring into the line of trees in the distance. The air smelled faintly of earth and coming rain. For a moment, it almost felt like the calm he used to know. But then he caught it. A flicker, movement near the tree line, there and gone in the space of a blink. He didn't move immediately. Years of instinct told him to keep still, to watch without giving away that he was watching. Another flicker, a shadow shifting against the edge of the woods. Whoever it was, they were patient, too patient, the kind of patience that came from training. Marcus stepped back inside, his voice steady but low. "We've got company." Carter was on his feet instantly, moving to the door. Elena appeared from the hallway, her phone still in hand but her focus sharp. "How many?" "Just saw one," Marcus said, "but I'd bet there's more." Carter moved to the back of the house. Marcus turned his head, glancing out the rear window. At first, all he saw was the long stretch of road behind them, dappled with sunlight through the trees. But then, in the far distance, a glint, metal catching light, and the unmistakable shape of a dark sedan closing the gap. Elena's voice was calm but edged with urgency. "How close?" "Close enough," Carter replied. "They're pacing us for now." Marcus felt the shift in the vehicle's speed as Carter pressed the accelerator, the engine humming deeper. Sarah's hands tightened further, and he could feel her tension radiating like static in the air. "What happens if they catch up?" Marcus asked. Elena's eyes flicked to the side mirror. "If they wanted to stop us peacefully, they'd have done it already." "Carter, take the long route through Ridge Road. Let's see if they follow." They did. The sedan took every turn they did, never gaining enough to overtake but never falling far behind. The pattern was deliberate, methodical, the kind of pursuit that said this was no coincidence. Marcus's jaw tightened. He didn't like being boxed in, and he especially didn't like being boxed in with someone who had already told him she was being hunted. When Carter made a sharp turn onto a narrow service road that cut between two stretches of dense forest, the sedan followed. That was all the confirmation anyone needed. "All right," Marcus said, his voice suddenly quieter, more focused. "What's the plan?" Elena glanced at him. Plan is to get clear of them. Marcus shook his head. That's your plan. Mine's to make sure they can't follow us again. There was a brief, almost imperceptible shift in her expression, but she didn't argue. Carter's eyes met Marcus's in the rearview mirror just for a second, and there was an unspoken agreement in that look, the kind men shared when they understood a situation without needing words. A road ahead curved sharply to the left, and just before they reached it, Carter braked hard, pulling the SUV off onto a narrow strip of packed dirt that ran parallel to the road, but was hidden from the main view by a low rise. The trees here were thick enough to mask them if they stayed low. Marcus was already moving before the vehicle fully stopped. Stay here, he told Sarah, his tone leaving no room for argument. What are you? She began, but he was already out of the SUV. The sedan came around the curve seconds later, slowing slightly as if the driver was searching for where they'd gone. Marcus stayed behind the rise, watching it pass, memorizing the face of the man in the passenger seat. Sharp features, shaved head, the kind of eyes that didn't look away from their mark. When the sedan had just cleared the curve, Marcus moved quickly, circling through the trees until he was parallel with the road ahead of them. He picked up a fallen branch, thick, solid, and tossed it into the path of the car. It wasn't enough to stop them outright, but it forced the driver to swerve hard, tires screeching as the car slid sideways into the ditch. The sound of metal scraping earth echoed through the trees. Marcus didn't wait for them to recover. He jogged back to the SUV, sliding in beside Sarah as Carter accelerated back onto the road in the opposite direction. You could have just driven away, she said, her voice caught between fear and disbelief. Yeah, Marcus replied evenly. But now they'll need a tow before they can follow us again. Bought us time. The SUV sped on, the road unwinding ahead of them, but the mood inside had shifted. Sarah's gaze lingered on Marcus in a way it hadn't before, not just as the man who'd stopped to help her once, but as someone who had just stepped directly into her fight without hesitation. Elena said nothing, but there was a faint nod, almost to herself, as though something she'd suspected about him had just been confirmed. Carter kept driving, his focus unbroken. Elena's voice was calm, but there was a quiet intensity beneath it. We're not asking you to fight them, Marcus. We're asking you to stay close. Keep her somewhere you trust. You have the kind of presence that makes people think twice before stepping too close. That's exactly what she needs right now. Marcus rubbed a hand over his jaw, the weight of the situation settling heavier on his shoulders. I've got a job. A life. I'm not some bodyguard. Sarah leaned forward, her eyes meeting his with an urgency that bypassed words. I know you don't owe me anything, but yesterday you didn't just change my tire. You kept something bad from happening. I don't know if I'll get that lucky twice. The room was silent after that. The kind of silence that wasn't empty but full, of unspoken truths, of decisions waiting to be made. Outside, the wind stirred the branches against the windows, a soft, restless sound. Marcus knew himself well enough to recognize the shift when it happened. He might have wanted a quiet life, but he couldn't pretend he hadn't already stepped into this. He could walk away now, but he'd think about it later. About the woman in the roadside dusk, and the way she'd looked at him just now, not with expectation, but with a kind of desperate hope. Finally, he exhaled. All right, but I need to know exactly who we're dealing with. Elena and Sarah exchanged a glance, and it was Elena who answered. You'll find out soon enough. But first we need to move. They know where she was yesterday, and they'll be looking for her again today. Carter was already at the door before she'd finished speaking, scanning the tree line as though expecting company. Marcus stood, the low thud of his boots on the wooden floor sounding louder than it should. The stillness of the lodge felt fragile, like glass. And somewhere deep inside he knew it wouldn't take much for it to say, Hatter, the road out. The moment they stepped out of the lodge, the world felt different. The sunlight had shifted to that late morning glare that made every shadow seem deeper, sharper, and somehow less trustworthy. The gravel crunched under their feet as Carter opened the SUV's rear door for Sarah, but Marcus's eyes weren't on the car, they were on the tree line. The forest surrounding the lodge was still, too still, and he found himself scanning the edges for movement. It wasn't paranoia. It was instinct. Inside the SUV, the air was thick with a quiet tension. Sarah sat beside Marcus in the back, her hands clasped together so tightly he could see the faint tremor in her fingers. Elena, sitting in the front passenger seat, kept her gaze fixed on the road ahead while Carter drove with the kind of focus that said he was expecting trouble. For a while, the only sound was the steady hum of the engine and the occasional crack of gravel under the tires as they navigated the winding path back to the main road. Marcus leaned slightly towards Sarah, his voice low but steady. "You ever think about just leaving the country? Disappearing?" Her eyes flicked to his, and for a second he saw something raw there, a kind of tired defiance. "I have. But disappearing isn't as simple as people think. And if I run, they'll just chase me harder. This isn't about where I am. It's about what they think I have." Marcus nodded slowly, understanding more than she knew. Sometimes danger wasn't about distance. It was about the tether people believed they had on you. He'd seen it in other parts of life, different stakes, but the same grip. They had just reached the turnoff that would take them back toward Brooksville when Carter's hand shifted subtly on the steering wheel. "We've got a tail," he said, his tone clipped and precise. The thought crossed his mind that walking away now would be the smart move. Let this be someone else's problem. But another thought followed quickly behind. The image of Sarah on the side of that road, her hands trembling as she tried to wrestle with the tire iron. The kind of fear she'd carried in her eyes wasn't the kind you just left behind. Without a word, he stood, grabbed his jacket, and locked the door behind him. The SUV's interior was just as refined as its exterior. Soft leather seats, the faint scent of something expensive and subtle, and windows tinted enough to make the world outside seem a shade darker. Marcus sat in the back with Elena, Carter in the front, his posture so upright he could have been carved from stone. They didn't drive far, maybe 20 minutes out of town, before the landscape began to shift from the familiar quiet of Brooksville to a stretch of wooded back roads that felt almost too secluded. The trees here grew thick and tall, their branches lacing overhead like a canopy, muting the sunlight into dappled shadows. Eventually, the SUV slowed, turning onto a gravel path that led to a small lodge tucked away from the main road. It wasn't abandoned, but it didn't look like a place people stumbled upon by accident either. Inside, the air was warm, scented faintly with cedar. The front room was sparsely furnished, a couch, 2 chairs, a coffee table, but everything was spotless. Sitting at the far end of the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, was Sarah. She looked up the moment Marcus stepped in, and for a second something in her face softened. Relief, recognition, maybe even gratitude, before tension quickly returned to her features. "Marcus," she said quietly, as though the name itself was an anchor she needed in the room. He gave her a small nod. "Didn't expect to see you again so soon." "Neither did I," she admitted. Her voice was steady, but Marcus could see the same unease from the roadside, only deeper now. Whatever she'd been worried about then hadn't gone away. It had grown. Elena crossed the room and sat opposite her. "Sarah, tell him what you told me." Sarah hesitated, her gaze flickering toward Carter, then Marcus, before she finally spoke. "Yesterday, when my tire blew out, it wasn't an accident. Someone tampered with it. I was supposed to be stuck there long enough for them to get to me." Marcus's brows drew together. "Get to you? For what?" Sarah swallowed hard. "My father. Before he passed, he worked for a company involved in some very sensitive research. He left me something they think I have. I don't, but they won't believe me. I've been followed for weeks." She paused, her voice trembling for the first time. "I think they were planning to take me yesterday, but then you stopped and they drove past. I don't think they wanted a witness." Marcus leaned back slowly, piecing the story together in his head. The way she'd kept looking over her shoulder on the road. The subtle urgency in Elena's voice that morning. Now it was all starting to fit. And it didn't sit well with him. "So you're saying whoever's after you knows what I look like now, and you want me to just step into this?" Marcus shook it firmly. "Marcus Turner, Coffee's inside." They entered the small but tidy living room, Carter following silently like a shadow. Marcus moved into the kitchen, the familiar sounds of clinking mugs and the slow drip of his old coffee maker grounding him as he tried to make sense of the situation. From the corner of his eye, he saw Elena settle into the armchair by the window, crossing her legs with deliberate poise while Carter remained standing near the door, scanning the room as if cataloging every detail. It wasn't until the coffee was poured and the first sip taken that Elena finally spoke again. "Mr. Turner, Sarah Coleman is more than a friend. She's connected to a situation that requires discretion. Yesterday you stopped to help her when most people would have driven past. That one act may have changed the course of what's about to happen." Marcus raised an eyebrow, leaning back in his chair. "With respect, Ms. Drake, I don't see how changing a tire could be that important." Elena set her cup down carefully, her gaze never leaving his. "Because someone was watching her, Marcus, and when you stopped to help, they saw you too." The words hung in the air, heavier than they should have been. Marcus's mind flashed back to the quiet road, the blinking hazard lights, Sarah's nervous glances up and down the stretch of asphalt. She had seemed uneasy, more than just stranded. He hadn't pressed her about it then, chalking it up to the stress of being stuck alone, but now— "You're saying I got involved in something without knowing it," Marcus said slowly. Elena inclined her head. "You're involved whether you like it or not, but that doesn't have to be a bad thing. Sarah trusts you, and right now, trust is in short supply." Marcus studied her face for a long moment. He wasn't the kind of man who liked games, and this felt like one. But there was Al, so something undeniably real in her tone, a seriousness that couldn't be faked. "What exactly do you need from me?" he asked. Her answer was quiet but clear. "I need you to protect her, at least for the next few days." He almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. "Protect her? From who?" Elena's eyes didn't waver. "From people who think she has something they want, and who will stop at nothing to get it." The room seemed to shrink around Marcus as he let her words sink in. He had gone to bed last night thinking he'd just helped a stranger in need. Now, before breakfast had even finished brewing, a woman in a black SUV was asking him to stand between that stranger and danger he couldn't yet define. And though every reasonable part of him wanted to say no, there was something in the back of his mind, maybe the same instinct that had made him pull over on Route 6 in the first place, that told him walking away wasn't an option anymore the second meeting. Marcus didn't say yes immediately. He wasn't the kind of man to jump into something without weighing it in his mind, even if his instincts were already leaning in a certain direction. After Elena Drake's request hung in the air like the first low rumble before a storm, he leaned back in his chair, his hand resting around his coffee mug, and studied her in silence. She didn't fidget, didn't rush to fill the quiet. She simply waited, her gaze fixed on him as if she knew that patience would win out. And maybe it did, because after several moments Marcus sighed. "If I'm going to protect someone, I at least need to know what I'm protecting them from." Elena's lips curved in the faintest acknowledgement. "Then it's time you met her again, in the right setting." She stood, the movement precise and unhurried as Carter, the ever-silent shadow, stepped forward to open the door. "She's not far. From here. We'll explain on the way." Marcus glanced at the clock. He had work at the community center in less than 2 hours. The visitors. The driver's door opened with a slow, deliberate motion, and Marcus watched as a tall man in a dark suit stepped out, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. Even in the soft haze of early morning light, the man's presence felt sharp, deliberate, and heavy with intent. He moved with the calm precision of someone who didn't waste energy on unnecessary gestures. His eyes, hidden behind tinted sunglasses despite the sun barely cresting the horizon, scanned Marcus's modest property before locking onto him. Marcus straightened instinctively, setting his coffee mug on the porch rail and stepping down to the yard. He wasn't the kind to be easily intimidated. He'd worked in rough neighborhoods during his younger years, and he'd learned that most people with an air of authority were just people in the end. But something about this visitor made the air feel charged. The man spoke in a low, measured tone, his voice smooth but firm. "Marcus Turner?" Marcus nodded. "That's me. You here for a repair job? Because I usually get calls, not visits like this. He kept his voice casual, but his mind was already turning over the possibilities. The man's lips twitched in what might have been the shadow of a smile, but it vanished almost as soon as it appeared. Not exactly. My name's Carter. I work for someone who'd like to speak with you. He stepped aside slightly and gestured toward the SUV. Marcus followed the gesture and saw the rear passenger window lower just enough to reveal the outline of someone sitting inside. The first thing he noticed was the glint of light on expensive jewelry. A bracelet, maybe, followed by the faintest trace of perfume drifting on the breeze. Then, a woman's voice, calm yet unmistakably authoritative, cut through the space between them. "Mr. Turner," she said, "you helped a friend of mine yesterday. Changed her tire en route." Chapter 6. Marcus frowned slightly. "Sarah?" "Yes," the voice confirmed. "Sarah Coleman." The tone was smooth, but beneath it there was an undercurrent of something else. Urgency, perhaps, or gratitude sharpened by caution. "I wanted to thank you in person." It was strange. Gratitude was usually offered with warmth, but this woman's words felt deliberate, almost calculated. Marcus took a slow step closer, stopping just short of the SUV's shadow. "I appreciate that," he said, "but it wasn't a big deal. Just a flat tire." The woman's laugh was soft but hollow, as if she knew something he didn't. "It was more than you think, Mr. Turner. More than you could have known." She paused for a heartbeat, as though weighing her next words. "Would you be willing to come with us? I promise it will be worth your time." That was when Marcus's instincts stirred. In his 35 years, he'd learned that nothing good ever started with vague invitations from strangers in expensive vehicles. He crossed his arms loosely. "With all due respect, ma'am, I don't get into cars unless I know where I'm going and why." There was a long moment of silence from the SUV, then the woman's voice again, softer this time. "Fair enough, may I come in then?" Marcus hesitated. A lifetime of small-town living had taught him to be hospitable, but another part of him, the part shaped by occasional hard lessons in the outside world, told him to tread carefully. Still, something in her tone made him curious. He stepped back toward his porch and gestured toward the front steps. "All right, you can come in, but I'm making coffee for everyone and nobody brings trouble through my door." The SUV's rear door opened and the woman stepped out. She was dressed in a tailored charcoal coat that fell just past her knees, her heels clicking softly against the gravel as she approached. Her hair was pulled back in a smooth, elegant twist, and her eyes, a clear, assessing gray, swept over Marcus's home with an expression that revealed nothing. She extended a hand. "Elena Drake," he said with a small smile as he grabbed the spare from her trunk. "Let's get you back on the road." The work wasn't complicated, but it wasn't easy either. The lug nuts were stubborn, the jack needed adjusting, and the light was fading fast. Sarah hovered nearby, offering to help, but clearly not sure what to do. Marcus kept the conversation going, asking where she was headed and learning she was coming back from visiting her aunt in a neighboring town. She worked in the city, she said, but had driven out here for a few days of quiet. Her voice had that mix of politeness and exhaustion that told him she'd had a long day before the tire even gave out. Within 20 minutes, the spare was on, the tools packed away, and Sarah was ready to go. She tried to offer him money, a crisp bill she pulled from her purse, but Marcus shook his head. "No need," he said firmly. "Just help the next person you see who needs it. That's payment enough." She hesitated, then tucked the bill back into her wallet. "Well, at least let me buy you coffee sometime. You really saved me here." Marcus just smiled, tipping his cap. "Maybe. Take care now, and drive safe." He watched her taillights disappear around the bend before climbing back into his truck. By the time he got home, the sun had fully set and the small comforts of his house felt even warmer after the long day. He made a simple dinner, sat on his porch for a while, and thought about how sometimes helping a stranger felt like the most natural thing in the world. When morning came, Marcus was back in his usual rhythm. He woke before dawn, made coffee, and stepped outside to watch the sky shift from purple to gold. The day looked calm, unremarkable, until he heard it. the low hum of an engine, deep and steady, approaching his street. A vehicle turned the corner, its headlights cutting through the early light. It wasn't the kind of car people drove in Brooksville. This one was sleek, expensive-looking, and painted in the kind of deep black that seemed to swallow the sunlight. A large SUV, windows tinted dark enough to hide whoever was inside, rolled slowly toward his house. Marcus set his coffee down, frowning slightly. No one he knew drove anything like that. The SUV came to a stop right in front of his gate. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the driver's door opened. And that's when Marcus realized his life was about to change forever. The roadside stranger, Marcus Turner, had a quiet rhythm to his life, the kind of steady routine most people dreamed of but rarely achieved. At 35, he had no illusions about being rich or famous, but he did have something he valued more: peace. He lived in a modest one-story house on the edge of Brooksville, a town where mornings smelled of fresh bread from the bakery and evenings carried the sound of crickets singing in the tall grass. The house had belonged to his parents, and every creak in the floorboards felt like a voice from his childhood. The walls still held the faint scent of his mother's lavender polish, and the old oak tree out front had been his father's pride, its branches strong enough to hold a swing for little Marcus back when the world felt impossibly big. He worked as a maintenance technician at the community center, a place that wasn't much to look at from the outside but meant the world to the people inside. Marcus could fix almost anything: leaking faucets, jammed doors, broken basketball hoops. But his real gift was the way he treated people. Whether it was a child who'd scraped their knee on the playground or an elderly man who needed someone to listen to his war stories for the 100th time, Marcus gave them his full attention. In a town where everyone knew everyone else's name and history, he was the one you called when you needed help and didn't want to feel like you owed anyone for it. That Thursday had been a long one. An unexpected storm the night before had knocked out part of the center's roof tiles, and he'd spent the day climbing ladders, hauling supplies, and making repairs while the summer heat pressed down on his back. By the time the sun began its slow descent toward the hills, all he wanted was a quiet drive home, a cold shower, and maybe one of those homemade pies Mrs. Jenkins sometimes sent him home with from the diner. He took the back road, the one that curved through wide fields and narrow tree-lined stretches, because it felt like driving through a painting. The air smelled faintly of rain-soaked earth, and the golden light filtering through the trees made the world look softer somehow. It was just past the old Miller's Bridge when Marcus saw the car. It sat awkwardly on the gravel shoulder, one side tilted lower than the other. At first he thought maybe someone had just stopped to take in the view of the river, but as he got closer, he saw a woman kneeling by the front tire, her hands trembling as she tried to wrestle with a stubborn lug nut. Even from a distance he could tell she was struggling. The hazard lights blinked in slow, tired rhythm, and she kept glancing nervously up and down the road as if hoping someone would appear. Marcus slowed down, his truck tires crunching over the gravel as he pulled up behind her car. He didn't think twice. That was just who he was. He climbed out, the fading sunlight catching on his dark skin and the sweat-stained brim of his cap. "Evening, ma'am," he called gently, keeping his voice warm so she wouldn't be startled. "Looks like you've got yourself some trouble." The woman looked up and Marcus could see the worry in her eyes. She was maybe in her late 20s with light brown hair pulled back in a loose bun and a blouse that was far too nice for roadside work. A streak of dirt ran across her cheek where she'd wiped sweat away with the back of her hand. "Yeah," she said with a nervous laugh. "Flat tire, and She hesitated, looking almost embarrassed. "I've never changed one before. I called a service, but they said it could be hours." Marcus nodded. "Well, no need to wait that long. I've changed more tires than I can count. If you don't mind, I can take care of it for you." Relief washed over her face and she stepped a piece side, brushing her hands on her skirt. "Thank you, I really appreciate it. I'm Sarah, by the way, Sarah Coleman." "Marcus Turner?"